I helped my wealthy neighbor carry her groceries in the rain. The next morning she showed up at my door crying, holding documents with my late mother's name on them. What I uncovered next shook the most powerful family in town to its core. The rain started without warning. One moment the sky was gray and heavy, the next it cracked open like something inside it had finally snapped. I was closing up the garage, wiping old grease off my hands with a rag that had seen better decades, when I noticed the black car sitting crooked at the side of the road, hazard lights blinking orange in the downpour, like a quiet distress signal nobody else was bothering to answer. I almost went back inside. The Beaumont estate sat at the end of Aldermere Lane like it had always existed and always would. Everyone in this town knew that name, said it the way you say the name of something untouchable, with either reverence or quiet resentment, depending on which side of life you were born on. I was firmly on the wrong side. My garage sat at the edge of their world, like an uninvited guest who'd learned not to knock. But there was a woman standing in the rain, struggling with bags that probably cost more than my rent, and whatever else I am, I'm not the kind of man who watches someone drown on dry land. I jogged over. "Need a hand?" She turned, and I recognized her immediately. Isabella Beaumont. I'd seen her face in the local paper, ribbon cuttings, charity dinners, always photographed from the right angle, always smiling the exact right amount. In person, she looked younger than the papers made her seem, and considerably more irritated. "The boot is jammed," she said flatly. Then she looked at me properly. "You're the mechanic, from the garage down the road." "Dean Miller," I said. "That's me." She handed me a bag without another word. I took it. We made 3 trips through the hammering rain, me carrying the heavy ones, her insisting on the smaller bags in a way that made clear she wasn't someone comfortable with being helped. By the time we stepped inside the entrance hall of the estate, I was leaving wet footprints across marble floors that probably cost more per square foot than my entire garage. "Just set them in the kitchen," she said, peeling off her coat. I followed her down a corridor wider than most apartments. Oil paintings in gilded frames, side tables with fresh flowers. The whole place smelled of old wood, expensive candles, and the particular silence of a house where no one raises their voice because no one ever has to. I set the bags on the kitchen counter and turned to leave. That's when I saw it. Hanging near the staircase, an old framed photograph, slightly tilted, in a dark wooden frame worn soft at the corners. A woman standing in a garden, laughing at something beyond the camera. Dark hair pulled loosely to one side, a small silver locket at her throat, and a way of standing, weight shifted to one foot, chin lifted just slightly, that hit me somewhere behind the ribs and didn't let go. I knew that locket. I had held that locket in my 11-year-old hand at a funeral, and I had never really let go of it. My mother, who had worked 3 jobs her whole life, who had never once said the name Beaumont, who had told me her past was nothing interesting, was hanging in a gilded frame inside a mansion I had walked past 1,000 times without ever being invited through the door. I took one step toward the photograph. "Those bags go on the—" Isabella's voice came from behind me and then stopped dead. I turned around. She had gone completely white. Her eyes moved from me to the photograph and back again, and I watched something move across her face. Recognition, then calculation, then a decision. All in about 3 seconds. She walked past me, lifted the photograph off the wall, and turned it face first against the plaster. "Thank you for your help," she said, perfectly calm. "I can manage from here." I walked back through that marble corridor, back into the rain, back to my side of Aldermere Lane. There was nothing I could demand. I was in her house, her world. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling and tried to build a version of events where that photograph made sense. My mother in the garden of the Beaumont estate, young, laughing like someone who belonged there. She had never laughed like that in any photograph I owned. By 4 in the morning, I'd stopped trying to explain it and started trying to remember everything she had never told me, every question she'd quietly redirected, every town she'd refused to revisit, every time she'd gone still when the radio played something old. There had been a lot of stillness. I had always taken it for grief. I was beginning to think it was something heavier than that. At 8 the next morning, someone knocked on the garage door. Isabella Beaumont was standing on the other side, still in yesterday's clothes, hair unbrushed, holding a dusty cardboard box against her chest, the way you hold something fragile. Her eyes were swollen. She'd been crying for a long time, the kind that dries up and leaves a person just hollow. She held the box out toward me. "I found this hidden behind a wall panel in the library," she said. Her voice cracked slightly at the edge. "There are documents inside, Mr. Miller." She paused. "Your mother's name is on all of them." I took the box. My whole life, I had known I was missing something I couldn't name. I had built everything, the garage, the quiet routines, the grease-stained normalcy, around that absence. Standing in my doorway with that dusty box in my arms, I understood the absence was finally about to speak. I just didn't know yet what it was going to cost me to listen. "Come in," I said, and I stepped back to let her through. The documents inside the box weren't much to look at. Yellowed papers, brittle at the edges, a few black and white photographs, some handwritten letters folded so many times the creases had gone soft. But Isabella sat across from me at my workbench, the same bench where I'd spent 15 years fixing other people's broken things, and watched my face as I went through each one like she already knew they were going to change something. My mother's name appeared on the 3rd page, Eleanor Miller, employed, Beaumont Estate, March 1987. Just like that, matter of fact, like it was nothing. Like my mother hadn't spent her entire life making sure I never knew she'd worked inside that house. "How long did she work there?" I asked. "I don't know," Isabella said quietly. "I didn't even know she existed until last night." I looked up at her. She meant it. Whatever was buried in that house, it had been buried from Isabella, too. We spent an hour going through the box together. Most of it was administrative, household records, staff rosters, inventory lists from the estate's earlier years. But tucked near the bottom was a single envelope with no name on the outside, sealed with wax that had cracked clean through. Inside was half a letter, the bottom portion torn away, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. "She has handled matters no one else would touch. The estate's survival during the collapse of '89 owes more to Eleanor than any member of this family is willing to admit." What was asked of her was not small. What she was given in return was not enough. I read it twice. Then I set it down. "There's more," Isabella said. "I think there's more inside the house. There's a room, a locked storage room behind the library shelves. I found the door last night, but I didn't have the key." She paused. "My uncle and his family are attending a charity event in the city today. We have a few hours." I should have said no. I was a mechanic. This was not my world, not my house, not my fight. Not yet. "Let's go," I said. The hidden room was exactly where Isabella described, behind a section of library shelving that swung outward on a hinge so old it groaned like it was in pain. The smell hit us first. Dust, damp paper, and something else underneath. The particular staleness of a place that has been sealed not by accident, but by intention. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been left. Wooden crates stacked along one wall, a folding table with ledger books arranged in a neat row, their spines cracked. Old uniforms hung from a single rail, household staff uniforms, pressed and preserved, and photographs, a dozen of them, pinned to a corkboard that leaned against the far wall. My mother was in almost every one, not in the background, not hovering at the edges the way staff appear in old estate photographs, half invisible, faces slightly turned. She was present, standing beside an older man I didn't recognize, both of them bent over documents spread across a large desk, pointing at something, focused, like she was the one running the meeting. "That's my grandfather," Isabella said softly, stopping beside me. "Edward Beaumont." I studied the photograph for a long moment. There was nothing romantic in it, nothing like that. It was two people working. But there was a familiarity between them, a shorthand in their posture that told me they had spent a significant amount of time solving significant problems together. The ledgers told the rest of the story, or the beginning of it. The Beaumont estate in the late 1980s had been in serious trouble. Bad investments, a corrupt business partner bleeding the accounts dry, debts mounting quietly behind the family's public face. The numbers were damning. But then, around mid-1989, the ledgers shifted. Accounts stabilized. Debts were systematically cleared. Someone had gone through the finances with a sharp eye and a steadier nerve than anyone in the family seemed to have. There was no signature, but tucked inside the back cover of the final ledger was another unfinished letter, same handwriting as before. Eleanor saved this family from a collapse that would have been public and devastating. She did what she did not for money, but because he asked her to, because she trusted him. What she was promised afterward, what was owed to her and to... It ended there, torn, deliberately. "Someone didn't want this finished," I said. Isabella nodded. Her face had gone tight. "My uncle." I was about to say something when we both heard it, the creak of the front door, then footsteps in the corridor below, heavy, unhurried footsteps that belonged to someone who owned every floor they walked on. Her uncle was home 4 hours early. Isabella grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the room. Behind the uniform rail was a narrow door, a servant's corridor, barely wide enough for one person, smelling of old stone. We moved through it in the dark, single file, not breathing properly until we pushed out through a side exit and into the cold afternoon air. We stood in the garden with the estate looming behind us. I looked at Isabella. She looked at me. We both knew the same thing without saying it. Whoever tore those letters didn't just want to bury the past. They were still protecting something. We didn't talk much on the drive out. Isabella offered her car. I drove, partly because she looked exhausted and partly because I needed something to do with my hands, or I was going to spend the whole journey turning those torn letters over in my head until I drove myself half mad. The countryside opened up around us as we left Aldermere behind, fields stretching wide and flat under a sky that couldn't decide between grey and white. Haworth was about 90 minutes east, a small town, the kind of small that doesn't appear on most maps unless you're already looking for it. I hadn't been back since my mother's funeral, and I hadn't planned on coming back after that. There's a particular kind of sadness that attaches itself to places where someone you loved spent their early life. A sadness that isn't grief exactly, more like standing in a room where the furniture's been moved and you keep reaching for things that aren't where they used to be. "Did she ever talk about it?" Isabella asked somewhere around the halfway mark. "Growing up here?" "No," I said. "She talked about it the way people talk about weather, briefly and without detail." Isabella turned to look out the window and didn't push further. I appreciated that. We found Father Clement at the church on Haworth's main road, a small stone building with a garden that was clearly tended by someone who took it seriously. He was trimming the hedges along the front path when we pulled up, a compact man in his late 70s with white hair and the kind of face that had spent decades listening to things people couldn't say anywhere else. He recognized my mother's name before I even finished saying it. Something moved across his face, warmth first, then something more careful. He set his shears down slowly and looked at me with the particular attention of someone measuring how much to say. "You have her eyes," he said quietly. "Come inside." The church was cool and dim, light falling in long, pale columns through narrow windows. We sat in the front pew, and Father Clement sat facing us, hands folded, and for a moment said nothing. The habit of a man who'd learned that silence often draws out more truth than questions. "Eleanor was one of the finest people I've known in 50 years of this work," he said finally. "Honest to a fault, stubborn in the best possible way." A small smile crossed his face, then faded. "And she made one choice that cost her everything." He told us carefully, choosing each word like he was placing something fragile down on a table. My mother had gone to work at the Beaumont estate at 22. She was sharp, organized, trusted quickly by Edward Beaumont himself. But somewhere in those years, she had fallen in love. Not with the grandfather, with his eldest son. A man named Thomas Beaumont, Isabella's older brother, 12 years dead now from a car accident on a wet road that the family had never discussed publicly in any detail. "They kept it hidden," Father Clement said. "Thomas wanted to bring it into the open. Eleanor was more cautious. She knew the family. She knew what they protected." "Did you know about me?" I asked. He met my eyes. "I knew Eleanor was pregnant when she left Haworth for the last time. She came to say goodbye." He paused. "She didn't tell me who the father was, but she was frightened in a way I had never seen her frightened before, and Eleanor did not frighten easily." The afternoon light shifted. Outside, a bird called twice and went quiet. "Was she forced to leave?" Isabella asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands in her lap were not. "I believe so," the priest said. Though she never said it in those words, she said she had made an agreement, that certain things had been arranged. She asked me to pray for her. He looked down. "I've been praying for her ever since." I sat with that for a moment. My mother had 20-something, frightened, pregnant, making an agreement she didn't choose, walking out of this town and never walking back into it. And somehow raising me to believe life was straightforward, that honesty was simple, that the world rewarded a man who worked hard and kept his word. She had built me out of everything she'd been denied. I was still processing that when Isabella touched my arm. I followed her eyes to the window. A dark car had parked across the road from the church. 2 men sat inside it, not talking, not looking at their phones, just watching the entrance with the specific stillness of people who had been told to watch and report, not to act. Yet, Father Clement had seen them too. His expression didn't change, but his voice dropped. "You should leave," he said. "There is a gate at the back of the cemetery. It opens onto the lower road." He stood, then gripped my hand with both of his. "Your mother protected something she believed was worth protecting." His eyes held mine. "I think she was protecting you." We moved quickly through the church and out into the cemetery, headstones casting long shadows in the pale afternoon light. I didn't look back, but I understood now, for the first time, that whatever my mother had agreed to, whatever she had signed or said or surrendered, someone was still making sure it held, and they'd followed us here to remind us of that. We drove for 40 minutes without a destination. I kept checking the mirrors. The dark car didn't follow us out of Haworth, or if it did, it was good enough at it that I couldn't tell. Eventually, the adrenaline settled into something quieter and heavier, and Isabella pointed at a roadside inn sitting alone off the main road, the kind of place that doesn't advertise because it's never really tried to attract anyone. A hand-painted sign, 2 cars in the lot, lights warm behind frosted windows. "We should stop," she said. "Think." I pulled in. The storm caught up with us about an hour later, rain against the windows, wind finding every gap in the old building's frame. We sat at a corner table with bad coffee and the box of documents between us, and for the first time since the night before, Isabella stopped holding herself together quite so carefully. "My uncle called me twice while we were in the church," she said. "I didn't answer." "What does he think you know?" I'm not sure. She wrapped both hands around her mug. But the moment I found that box and told him I'd been going through the library, his entire manner changed. He became very calm, very deliberate. That's how he gets when something is wrong. She looked up. He's not a violent man, but he is a thorough one. I thought about the two men in the car outside the church. Thorough was the right word. He's been protecting something for a long time, I said. People who do that get good at recognizing when the thing they're protecting is about to surface. Isabella nodded slowly. Then she said something that had clearly been sitting with her since the hidden room. The letter mentioned what my mother was promised, what was owed to her and to... She stopped. And then it was torn. Owed to her and to someone. Dean. She met my eyes. I think that someone is you. I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because hearing it said plainly, in a quiet inn during a storm, made it suddenly very real in a way that the documents and photographs hadn't quite managed yet. Clara's bakery was in Fenwick, a small town another 30 minutes west, so small it barely qualified as a town, more a cluster of buildings that had agreed to stay near each other. We found it the next morning, after a night of thin sleep on opposite sides of a very old inn wall. The bakery smelled of warm bread and sugar, and the particular comfort of a place run by someone who genuinely cared about what they made. Clara herself was in her early 60s, small and precise in her movements, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that missed absolutely nothing. She recognized Isabella's last name the way Father Clement had recognized my mother's, immediately, and with a reaction she had to work to control. I wondered if this day would come, she said. She turned the bakery sign to closed, locked the front door, and led us to a table near the back without another word. She and my mother had been close for years, before the estate, during it, and in the careful, cautious years after. They had written letters when calling felt too exposed. They had met occasionally in towns neither of them lived in. My mother had trusted Clara the way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. She received letters, Clara said, from someone inside that house, for years after she left. She never told me who sent them, but I could see what they did to her. Some made her cry, some made her angry. One made her peaceful, I think, for a little while. She paused. Then, about 2 months before she died, she came here with a tin box and she sat in that chair you're sitting in right now, and she burned every single one of them in my kitchen sink. Why? I asked. Fear, Clara said simply. She said she'd been warned, that if certain things came to light, it wouldn't just affect her, it would affect her son. Her eyes moved to me and held there. She burned them to protect you. You, specifically. The room was very quiet. But you kept one, Isabella said softly. She'd been watching Clara's face the way I'd been watching it, and we'd both seen the same thing. The slight steadying of breath. The hands that had gone just a little too still. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the front pocket of her apron and produced an envelope so old the paper had gone the color of weak tea. She set it on the table between us. I told her I'd burned them all, Clara said quietly. I lied. I kept one because I was afraid the truth would die with her and nobody would ever know what was done. Her jaw tightened. Eleanor deserved better than to disappear. I opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside was short. One paragraph, written in the same handwriting I'd seen in the ledger. Formal, controlled, but with a pressure to the pen strokes that suggested the writer's composure was costing them something. The final line stopped me cold. In the eyes of what my father intended and what the law should have honored, the estate in part belongs to the maid's child. That will not change simply because my brother is determined to pretend otherwise. I read it twice. Then I folded it, put it back in the envelope, set it in my jacket pocket like it was something ordinary. My hands were completely steady. The rest of me was not. The letter changed things. Not in the way emotions change things. That had already happened, somewhere between the photograph on Isabella's wall and the cemetery gate in Hayworth. This was different. This was the shift from feeling like something was wrong to being able to prove it. Those are two entirely separate experiences, and only one of them is dangerous to the people who've been doing the wrong thing. Isabella knew a name. An old lawyer, Gerald Holt, who had worked exclusively for the Beaumont family for nearly 3 decades before quietly retiring to the city about 6 years ago. She'd heard the name at the edges of family conversations growing up, never discussed directly, just referenced occasionally, the way families reference people they've paid to stay silent, with a kind of careful casualness that a child notices, but doesn't understand until much later. He drafted the family's legal documents going back to the 80s, Isabella said, as we drove into the city the following morning. Every will, every contract, every transfer of property. If my grandfather changed anything, if he made any provision for your mother, Gerald Holt would have written it. And then your uncle would have made sure Holt stayed quiet about it, I said. Yes. She said it without flinching. She'd had enough time now to stop being surprised by what her family was capable of. That particular process, the collapse of a version of people you loved, had been happening quietly behind her eyes since the hidden room, and she was coming out the other side of it, clearer and colder than before. I respected that. It isn't easy to look at the people who raised you and see them accurately. Gerald Holt lived in a narrow, terraced house in one of the city's older residential streets, the kind of street that was grand once and hadn't quite let go of the memory. The man who answered the door was somewhere in his mid-80s, thin as paper, wearing a cardigan that had been washed so many times it had gone smooth at the elbows. He had the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the fine print of other people's lives. The moment he saw Isabella, his face did something complicated. "Miss Beaumont," he said. Just that, like he'd been expecting her for years and was disappointed it had taken this long. "May we come in?" she asked. A long pause. Then he stepped back from the door. His front room was floor-to-ceiling books, the kind actually read rather than displayed, spines cracked, margins annotated, pages bent at corners. He sat in a high-backed chair and looked at us both for a long moment without speaking, the habit of a man who had learned to let other people show their hand first. Isabella set the surviving letter on the side table beside him. He looked at it without touching it. The color in his face shifted slightly. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "Clara Hewitt kept it," I said. "My mother burned the rest." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was looking at me with an expression I recognized. The particular guilt of someone who did the wrong thing for reasons that felt adequate at the time and have felt less adequate with every passing year. "I can't help you," he said. "I'm sorry. What that family can still do to a man my age, you don't understand the reach they have." "I think I'm beginning to," I said. "Mr. Holt," Isabella leaned forward. "My grandfather, what did he intend before he died? What was in the updated will?" "I cannot, please." Her voice was quiet, but it had weight behind it. "I am not my uncle. I need to know what my family did." Another silence. The old man looked at his hands. Outside, a bus rumbled past the window, and the room shuddered slightly and went still again. Then I placed my mother's photograph on the table beside the letter. The one Clara had given me, my mother young, laughing, alive in a way I had never personally witnessed. Gerald Holt looked at the photograph for a long time. And then something in him gave way. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a slow exhalation, like a building settling, like a man finally setting down something that had been breaking his back for 20 years without him letting himself admit it. "Your mother," he said carefully, "uncovered a fraud that would have destroyed the Beaumont estate entirely. The business partner, a man named Creed, had been systematically siphoning funds for years using forged authorizations. Eleanor found the discrepancies in the accounts. She built the case against him. She gathered the evidence, organized the records, and presented everything to Edward Beaumont at enormous personal risk, because Creed had connections, and people who crossed him had a habit of finding themselves in difficult circumstances." He paused. Edward was a complicated man, proud, traditional, not always kind, but he was not dishonest. He was genuinely grateful, and he updated his will to reflect that gratitude. He looked at me directly. A portion of the estate, 15%, was formally designated to Eleanor Miller and her descendants. It was legal. It was witnessed. I drew up the documents myself. The room felt very still. "And then he died," I said. "A heart attack, sudden, 3 weeks after the updated will was signed." Holt's mouth pressed thin. "And within a month, your uncle, Robert Beaumont, came to me with the original will and told me the updated version had never existed. He had the document. He had the witnesses. Or rather, he had whatever he'd given the witnesses to make them cooperative." His voice dropped. "He also had a very detailed knowledge of a personal matter involving my son that could have ended his career. So I said nothing. I have said nothing for 20 years. I sat back. 15%, legal, witnessed, buried. "The copy," Isabella said suddenly. "You said he had the document, but you drew it up. Did you keep copies?" The old man looked at her with something close to relief, the look of someone who has been waiting for exactly that question. He stood slowly, crossed to the far bookshelf, and reached behind a row of legal volumes. He produced a large brown envelope, sealed, with a date written across the front in faded ink. A date from 20 years ago. "I kept everything," Gerald Holt said quietly. "I told myself it was professional habit." He held the envelope out. "But I think I was waiting for someone to come and ask." The envelope changed the game entirely. Inside were 3 documents: the updated will, a signed witness statement, and a detailed financial record showing exactly how Edward Beaumont had intended to transfer the designated portion of the estate. Everything dated, everything notarized, everything Gerald Holt had quietly preserved behind a row of legal books for 2 decades, while guilt ate at him 1 year at a time. We made copies that same afternoon, 3 sets, one with Holt, one with Isabella, one that I folded into the inside pocket of my jacket and kept there like a second heartbeat. Then we drove back to Aldermere in near silence, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but loaded, 2 people carrying the same weight in different ways. That evening, Isabella called me from the estate.
"Robert is hosting the annual charity gala here on Saturday," she said. "Politicians, judges, half the county's money in one room. He does it every year. It's partly generosity and partly a reminder of who he is and what he controls." A pause. "His private office is on the 2nd floor. He keeps physical files there, things he doesn't trust to computers. If there's anything else buried, anything he's used to keep people in line over the years, it'll be in that room." "You want to search it during the gala?" I said. "I want you to search it while I keep him occupied downstairs." Another pause, shorter this time. "I know what I'm asking." I thought about my mother burning letters in Clara's kitchen sink. I thought about Gerald Holt's face when he looked at her photograph. I thought about a torn letter and a will that had been made to disappear. "Tell me what to wear," I said. Saturday arrived grey and cold, which felt appropriate. The gala was exactly what I'd expected, and nothing I was prepared for. By 8 o'clock, the Beaumont estate was full of people who moved through expensive rooms the way water moves, effortlessly, like they'd never encountered a space that didn't accommodate them. Women in gowns that cost more than my car. Men in suits so well fitted they looked like a different species from the suits I'd worn to funerals. Waitstaff moving silently through the crowd with champagne and small food on small plates. I stood near the edge of the main room and felt every inch the mechanic in a borrowed jacket. Isabella found me within 10 minutes. She looked composed in the way that takes serious effort, dressed impeccably, moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd attended these events since childhood. But her eyes, when they found mine, were focused and steady.
"He's in the main reception room," she said quietly, barely moving her lips. "I'll keep him there. The office is second floor, third door on the left. The lock is simple. I left the window at the end of the corridor open. Go." I set my untouched champagne on a passing tray and moved. The second floor was a different world, quiet, dim, the noise of the gala below muffled to a low hum. I found the office without difficulty, and the lock was exactly as simple as Isabella had said, the kind that exists to keep honest people out, rather than determined ones. Robert Beaumont's office smelled of leather and cigarettes and controlled power. Bookshelves, a large mahogany desk, filing cabinets along one wall. I moved quickly and methodically, the way you search an engine when you know something is wrong but haven't found it yet. Systematic, no wasted movement. The filing cabinet in the far corner was locked with something more serious. I worked it for 3 minutes before it gave. Inside were hanging files, neatly labeled, financial records, correspondence, and near the back, a section with no label, just a plain manila folder, thicker than the rest. I opened it. Surveillance photographs. My mother, taken without her knowledge, outside her home, at a grocery store, walking me to school when I was small enough that I had to take 2 steps for every one of hers. Letters she'd written that had clearly been intercepted and copied. A signed document, her signature at the bottom, that I realized with cold clarity was the agreement Father Clement had mentioned, the one she'd called an arrangement, the one that had kept her silent. And paper-clipped to the front of the folder, a single handwritten note in Robert Beaumont's handwriting. "If she talks, use the boy." 3 words that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my mother's silence. She hadn't stayed quiet because she was beaten. She'd stayed quiet because they had threatened me. Every year of carefully maintained silence, every deflected question, every burned letter, every town she'd refused to revisit, had been her protecting a child who never knew he needed protecting. I was standing there holding the folder when the office door opened. Robert Beaumont stood in the doorway. He was a tall man, late 60s, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who has never once in his life been caught off guard and is experiencing it now for possibly the first time. He looked at me. He looked at the folder in my hands. He looked back at me. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He stepped inside the room, closed the door quietly behind him, and said, very calmly, very deliberately, "You have her eyes, you know. I noticed it the moment Isabella brought you into my world." He paused. "Your father had them too." The folder in my hands suddenly weighed nothing at all. "My father," I said. Robert looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite remorse and wasn't quite satisfaction, something uncomfortable sitting between the two. "Thomas loved her," he said. "Whatever else you think of this family, and I imagine right now you think very little, that part was real." He straightened slightly. "He was my brother, and you are his son." The gala continued below us. Glasses clinking, laughter rising through the floor. I stood in the middle of Robert Beaumont's private office, holding evidence of everything he'd done, and learned in the same moment exactly who I was. Robert Beaumont didn't try to take the folder. That surprised me more than anything he'd said.
He simply moved to the chair behind his desk and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man whose legs had gone unreliable beneath him. And he looked at me the way people look at things they've spent 20 years avoiding, with exhaustion rather than defiance. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He accepted that with a small nod. Outside the office window, the gala continued below in the gardens. Lights strung between trees, the low swell of conversation and music floating upward like everything was perfectly fine. "Thomas was 7 years older than Isabella," Robert began, without preamble, like he'd rehearsed this and simply wanted to get through it. "He was the one who should have run this family. Intelligent, considered, better than me in every way that mattered, and I knew it. And mostly I was glad of it, because it meant the responsibility would be his." He paused. "He met your mother in the spring of 1988. She'd been working at the estate for about a year. I noticed it before anyone else did, the way he found reasons to be in whatever room she was in." "Did your grandfather know?" "Eventually. He wasn't pleased initially. This was a different time. And he was a traditional man. But Thomas was immovable when he decided on something. And your mother was... she was remarkable. Even my grandfather came to see that." Something moved across Robert's face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "The plan was for Thomas to formally acknowledge the relationship after your grandfather's legal matters were settled, after Eleanor's contribution to the estate was properly recognized." "But your grandfather died first," I said. "Yes." The word came out flat and final. "And then Thomas died," I said, "on a wet road, suddenly, conveniently." The room went very quiet. Robert's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a subtle rearrangement, like furniture being moved in a dark room. He took a long breath. "I need you to understand something," he said carefully. "I did many things after my father died that I am not proud of. I destroyed the updated will. I used Gerald Holt's vulnerability to ensure his silence. I had your mother watched, and I used you, a child, as leverage to keep her quiet." His voice remained steady, but the effort was visible. "All of that was me. All of that was wrong." "But," I said, "Thomas's accident was an accident," he said. "I have asked myself that question every day for 12 years, every single day, and the answer is always the same. I did not arrange it. I did not want him dead. Losing Thomas was the thing that broke whatever was still decent in me, not the thing that revealed I had none." He met my eyes directly. "I am not asking you to believe me. I am telling you because it is true." I studied his face for a long moment. The honest truth was, I didn't know whether to believe him. And the honest truth beyond that was, it almost didn't matter right now. Isabella found me an hour later at the far end of the garden, away from the lights and noise. I told her everything Robert had said. She listened without interrupting, standing with her arms folded against the cold, her expression doing complicated things she mostly managed to keep controlled. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "About Thomas?" "I don't know," I said. "He believes it. Whether that makes it true is another question." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a lake house, about an hour north of here. It belonged to Thomas. My uncle never sold it. I think he couldn't bring himself to. It's been sitting empty for 12 years. She looked at me. "If Thomas kept anything, journals, correspondence, anything about your mother, it would be there. He kept everything that mattered to him there." We drove up the following morning through countryside that had gone amber and gold with the season. The lake house was smaller than I'd imagined. Not the grand property I'd associated with the Beaumont name, but something genuinely modest, tucked between trees at the water's edge, the kind of place a person goes when they want to be themselves rather than their family name. Inside, under a decade of dust and quiet, it was still entirely Thomas Beaumont's. Books he'd been reading, a half-finished painting on an easel near the window, landscape, the lake from this exact angle. And in the bedroom, in a wooden box beneath the bed with no lock because he'd never expected to need one, a stack of journals. 12 of them, written in a hand that was small and precise and urgent in the way that private writing gets when the writer is processing something they can't say aloud. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the first one, and my father, a man 12 years dead, whose face I'd never seen and whose name I'd never known, began, slowly, to become real. He had loved my mother completely and without reservation. That was clear from the first page and never once contradicted across all 12 journals. He wrote about her the way people write about things they know they might lose, with a fierce, almost desperate attention to detail. The way she argued, the way she laughed, the specific quality of her stubbornness that made him admire her even when it frustrated him. He had fought the family, quietly, persistently, in the way that careful people fight, building the case, documenting everything, working within the system because he understood the system well enough to know how to use it. He had intended to claim me publicly. It was written plainly, not as a plan, but as a certainty, the way you write about things you consider already decided. And then, in the final journal, 6 months before the accident, a single entry that made everything else fall into place. Robert came to the lake house today. We argued about Eleanor and the child for the last time. I made that clear. I told him I was moving forward regardless of the family's position. He left without another word. I have never seen my brother look at me the way he looked at me today. I don't know what it means. I'm choosing to believe it means he's finally accepted it. I sat with that entry for a long time. Outside, the lake was perfectly still. I chose, in that moment, to believe the same thing Robert had told me, that Thomas's death was an accident, that the look in his brother's eyes had been grief at losing the argument, rather than something colder. I chose it not because I was certain, but because I understood, finally, what my mother had understood before me. Some things you carry, some things you put down, and the ones you put down are not the ones that weren't real. They're the ones that will crush you if you don't. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Isabella. 3 words. He's made his move. Below it, a news article loading slowly on the screen. My name in the headline next to the word fraud. Robert Beaumont had gone public. The article was precise and devastating. Robert Beaumont had given an exclusive statement to 2 city newspapers simultaneously, the kind of coordinated move that tells you it wasn't reactive, but planned, sitting ready in a drawer for exactly this moment. The statement described me as a con artist who had manipulated his niece using a fabricated family connection, a mechanic with a history of financial disputes, which was a single unpaid invoice from 3 years ago that had been settled in a week, who had gained access to private estate documents through deception. It was fiction built around just enough verifiable detail to sound like fact. By the time Isabella and I drove back from the lake house, my phone had 12 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and one from a journalist who had somehow already found my garage's landline. Standing in my kitchen that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. The specific helplessness of being in a situation where the rules are being written by someone with more power than you, and the truth is sitting right there in your hands, but somehow insufficient. Isabella sat across from me and said nothing for a while. Then, "We have the will, the financial records, the letter, Gerald Holt's testimony, Thomas's journals." She said each one deliberately, like laying tools out before a job. He has a newspaper and a story. That's all he has. That's enough, I said. For now, it's enough. Then we move faster than he expects, she said. We file immediately. We don't wait for him to build anything else. The legal process was nothing like the movies make it. It was slow and exhausting and full of days that felt like nothing was happening, while in fact, everything was happening beneath the surface, the way weather builds. Our lawyer, a sharp woman named Priya Anand, who Isabella trusted and who looked at our evidence with the focused excitement of someone who'd been waiting for a case like this, filed within the week. Robert's legal team responded immediately and aggressively. Motions to dismiss, challenges to the authenticity of the documents, a formal complaint against Gerald Holt suggesting professional misconduct. Every procedural tool available deployed simultaneously, the legal equivalent of throwing sand in every direction and hoping some of it landed in our eyes. It bought him time, about 6 weeks of it, and then the court date arrived. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and considerably less dramatic. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the low administrative hum of a system that processed human conflict with the same energy it would process anything else. I sat beside Priya and tried to look like a man who belonged there rather than a mechanic who'd spent the last 2 months learning more about inheritance law than he'd ever intended to know. Robert sat on the other side with his legal team, 3 of them, expensive suits, the particular confidence of people who charged enough per hour that losing felt like a personal insult. Isabella was called to testify on the second day. She walked to the stand in a gray dress with her hair pulled back, and she told the truth. All of it, plainly, without performance or drama, in the steady voice of someone who had decided that clarity was more powerful than emotion. She described finding the box, the hidden room, the documents, her uncle's reaction, the surveillance folder I'd found in his office. Robert's lawyer cross-examined her for 40 minutes with the specific aggression reserved for people who've been paid to make a witness feel small. Isabella answered every question the same way, directly, without elaboration, without rising to the bait. By the end of it, she looked tired but unbroken. When she stepped down from the stand, she glanced at me briefly. I nodded once. She had done something I wasn't sure I could have done. Taken apart her own family in public, on the record, in the full knowledge that there was no version of this that put things back the way they were. That night, my phone rang at 2 in the morning, a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I'd stopped ignoring unknown numbers weeks ago. It was a neighbor from Aldermere Lane, voice tight with urgency. The Beaumont estate was on fire. I drove with the windows down in the cold, the orange glow visible in the sky a full mile before I reached the lane. 2 fire engines already there, a third arriving as I pulled up. The fire had taken hold in the east wing, the library, the hidden room, the servant corridors we'd escaped through weeks ago. The rest of the estate was threatened, but intact. I stood at the boundary of the property and watched, and understood immediately. The remaining evidence. Whatever we hadn't already removed from the library, ledgers, letters, records too fragile or too numerous to carry all at once, Robert was burning what was left. I moved before I fully decided to. A firefighter caught my arm. I told him about the library ledger, the original, the one my mother had protected, the one we hadn't managed to retrieve because her uncle had come home early. The one that contained the proof of the original fraud, the blackmail, the illegal will destruction. All of it in Edward Beaumont's own handwriting, annotated in margins my mother had filled in with her careful, precise hand. He looked at me for about 2 seconds. Then he handed me a jacket, a mask, and moved with me toward the east wing entrance. The smoke was thick and directional. The heat something you felt before you understood it. We moved low and fast through the servant corridor, I knew the layout now, had walked it in the dark, and into the outer edge of the library where the fire hadn't fully reached yet, but the air was barely breathable. The ledger was exactly where it had been, on the table, left behind. Perhaps because Robert assumed the fire would reach it. Perhaps because in his urgency he'd forgotten exactly where it sat. I grabbed it. We moved back through the corridor faster than I thought possible, the heat pressing at our backs, and came out through the side entrance into the cold night air, gasping like we'd surfaced from deep water. I stood on the grass with the ledger against my chest. Inside its pages, fraud, blackmail, the deliberate destruction of a legal document, 20 years of calculated silence enforced through fear. Inside its margins, my mother's handwriting, neat, precise, thorough. She had documented everything, all of it. In the margins of the very ledger she'd used to save the estate in the first place. She had known, I realized, known that one day someone would look, known that the truth needed a witness, even if that witness never got to speak. She had left me a voice when she could no longer use her own. 3 days later, Robert Beaumont was arrested at the estate. He didn't resist. He simply stood in the doorway of the house his father had built and let it happen with the composure of a man who had always known, somewhere beneath everything, that this day was coming. The trial lasted 11 days. 11 days of documents, testimony, financial records, and the slow, methodical dismantling of 20 years of carefully maintained deception. Priya was precise and relentless in the way that good lawyers are. Not theatrical, not aggressive, just extraordinarily prepared. She presented each piece of evidence the way you build a wall, one brick at a time, no gaps, no shortcuts, until the structure was so solid that Robert's legal team stopped trying to knock it down and started simply trying to limit the damage. Gerald Holt testified. Clara testified. Father Clement made the journey from Hayworth in a car arranged by Isabella and sat in the witness box with his hands folded and told the court everything he had told us in the church, and then a little more, details he'd held back that day, things he'd been carrying privately for decades that finally had somewhere to go. And the ledger. My mother's handwriting in those margins was the moment the courtroom changed. I felt it, a shift in the quality of the silence, the way people in the gallery leaned slightly forward. Priya read selected annotations aloud in a clear, unhurried voice, and my mother, Eleanor Miller, a woman who had worked 3 jobs and raised a son alone and burned her letters in a kitchen sink to keep him safe, spoke in that courtroom more clearly and more powerfully than anyone who was actually present. Robert Beaumont was convicted on 3 counts: fraud, destruction of a legal document, blackmail. He was sentenced on a Tuesday morning in November. I sat in the courtroom and watched them lead him out and felt nothing dramatic, no surge of triumph, just a quiet settling, like the last piece of a very long equation finally resolving to 0. The months that followed were strange in the way that aftermath is always strange. The legal transfer of my inheritance took time. These things always do. There are processes and valuations and documents that need signing in specific orders by specific people in specific rooms. Priya navigated all of it with the same focused efficiency she'd brought to everything else. Isabella cooperated fully and without resentment, which I hadn't taken for granted and didn't. There were journalists for a while. The story had everything they looked for: wealth, secrets, illegitimate heirs, a fire, a conviction. I gave one interview and declined everything after that. I had nothing to perform for anyone. My garage stayed open through all of it. I kept the same hours, worked the same jobs, went home to the same small house I'd always lived in. People in Aldermere treated me differently, some with curiosity, some with a new deference that made me uncomfortable, some, to their credit, exactly the same as before. Those last ones I appreciated most. On a cold morning in early spring, I stood inside the Beaumont estate for the first time as someone with a legal right to be there. It felt nothing like I'd imagined it would. The marble floors and gilded frames and careful silence were all exactly as I remembered from the night of the rain and the groceries and the photograph that had started everything. But the house felt different now. Not smaller exactly, but less certain of itself, like a person who has lost the particular confidence that comes from never being questioned. Isabella was waiting in the entrance hall. She looked better than she had in months, rested, clearer, more fully herself than she'd been through the weight of the trial. She'd had her own grieving to do, her own reckoning with the version of her family she'd believed in versus the version that had actually existed. She'd done that work quietly and without complaint, which was entirely consistent with everything I'd learned about her. "So," she said, "what do you want to do with it?" I looked around the entrance hall. The staircase where the photograph had hung, now empty, a lighter rectangle on the wallpaper where the frame had been. The corridor leading to the library, still faintly smelling of smoke even months later. I had thought about this question for a long time. "The servant quarters at the back," I said, "and the old gardens. They've been empty for years." Isabella nodded slowly, following my thinking. "A community workshop," I said, "and a center for local families who need somewhere to go, somewhere that actually functions, tools, resources, space, the kind of thing that would have helped my mother when she needed it." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, "She would have liked that." "I know," I said. "That's why." We broke ground in May. The renovation took the better part of a year. The servant quarters gutted and rebuilt, the gardens cleared and replanted, the old workshop behind the stables restored and equipped. I did a significant portion of the physical work myself, not out of necessity, but because I needed to. Because there is a particular kind of healing that only happens when your hands are involved. The center opened on a Saturday in the following spring. Families from Aldermere and the surrounding towns came with children on their shoulders and curiosity on their faces. Local tradespeople ran the first workshop sessions. The garden had vegetables already coming up. I stood at the edge of it all in the late afternoon light and watched. And I thought about my mother. Not the version that had been hidden and silenced and reduced to a name on old documents, but the real one. The woman who had walked away from this place with nothing but a child she was determined to raise well, and had done exactly that, on 3 jobs and sheer will, without ever letting me see the cost. She had not wanted revenge. I understood that completely now, had understood it somewhere around the moment I'd pulled the ledger from the burning library, though I hadn't had the words for it yet. Revenge would have meant she was still living inside what was done to her. She had refused that. She had taken the loss and the silence and the fear and built something good from it anyway. I was just finishing what she started. Isabella appeared at my shoulder with 2 cups of coffee and handed me one without ceremony, the easy shorthand of people who have been through something significant together. "She'd be proud of you," she said. I looked out across the garden. The families, the noise, the particular aliveness of a place being used for exactly what it should be used for. "I hope so," I said. The afternoon light held for a while longer. Then the day moved on, the way days do, indifferent to conclusions, carrying everything forward into whatever comes next. And that, I decided, was exactly enough.